Two little frog mouths. How lovely. No living. It's going to get changed. Yes, you know, change is as good as a holiday. All organised and cleaned. Including in there. I've just got to sort out weapons and armour and put all that back in. So I might start doing that now. What's this one? Two legs. Look. One Sword of a Norman. Viking sword. One Trinex. One makeshift
med lavt vett ljåpondara är sann och vänlig och friders tv och dräp
Satin och
þau stöð þýð ekki veldur hófuglegar úr hyggjustaf fagna fundur fregjar nýðja Fy Isakar skurmar, sås kogla bär, frönda
Shoes and you were in. I'll see you in a minute.
flöt jag nieder. Thåmonig met och moder rör, föder fall, för stoft hölja, fad berögut, ogorord hovi, merdar tyngde, moholin laga.
My pigs and my groups. There you go in there with the other bit of leather. Now, so there's the old, well, both pair of shoes, the leg wrapping shoes, and just me royal ones. They'll go with me spurs there. There's the axes that I've got, and a couple of the fight ready swords, and my sea axe, my pig head, my little Templar dagger, a couple of throwing axes, my 90-pound bow. Well, that goes for something else. There's me, like, that helmet, Chevron in the background there, that helmet, that helmet, that helmet with my gauntlets, and a couple of other bits, and a bit of library in the back there behind my arms. Then of course you've got me halberd and me chainmail greaves. If I can set this up right. There we go. Best part of it all. A bit of guard that I got off Lord Harold, Steve Thomas. I thought would go rather nicely with my Teutonic for a different version. And of course we've got a bit of Nordic garb. And of course your plain basic Nordic garb, or just like me tanner or whatever with the hood. Then I've got more of like a Jarl's attire, or Saxon could be, depending on how you want to portray. Then of course I've got the Lord of Livonia's attire that I made myself. And of course the last attire, which isn't medieval, mind you, this is for another bit of attire that I have made, my gentlemanly attire. Now, I've also got a pair of, I do believe they're green, although I can't see them, plus a pair, well, I'd say so, they're the same almost tone as that, so a pair of black pants and a pair of green pants with the green winigers and me red winigers. Also have me lovely belt, which has the foot ends on it. Also with coin purse, feasting kit, and a couple of other trinket bags. I'll just hang that up on the front there, that'll work. done.
Hello, my name is Jacob, and I am a Norse pagan. And today, we're talking about the Norse god, Odin. You may recognize the statue behind me. It is the Odin statue of Munich, Germany. I talked about this in detail in a video that I made in June, so if you want to learn more about this statue, where it came from, who built it, all those things, check out the video. I also leave an offering for Odin as well, of course. But we're actually here to continue my series talking about the Norse gods, or God Weeks, which is something I started back in March with Thor, and then I also made a video series with Freya and Loki, and I've also done a singular episode on Balder. So today we're going to be talking about Odin. Now, one thing that is actually different about the Odin week is that we have so much to talk about, and I've actually had to be kind of choosy what information I put in this week. So, of course, today we're going to be talking about the hard facts, what we know historically and from the Eddas about Odin. So this is going to be a very long video, but an informative video. So I'm going to get to that very soon because we have a lot to talk about. But the second episode this week, which will come out Wednesday, Odin's Day, is going to be talking about the many names of Odin and the many different aspects of him as well. And then, of course, Friday, we're going to be talking about the modern practice of honoring Odin today, where I bring in my own personal experiences and experiences of others within the community, as well as what we know from the source material on how to honor Odin in our modern age. So I think the best way to do this video, because I've already done a dry run, and I hated it, where I just went through my notes, basically line by line, and gave you the important information, stanza by stanza, and it was awful, and I think it doesn't give you the best image. I think it's incohesive. So I think the best way to do this is just to go through each of the stories Odin has mentioned, give you the summary and the key points that give us a bigger image of who Odin is and what he is within Norse mythology. So I hope you like the format. Again, I've done my research. I've done so much research for this video. I wanted to make sure I did it here at the Odin statue, but I do think this is going to be the best way to have Odin at least featured in one video in the best way possible. So, to begin, the first story in the Poetic Edda is the Völuspá. And this really is a framework for all of Norse mythos, because you have the beginning and you have the end. And most of these points are explored later on down the line within the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda. And Odin, of course, is one of the main characters in the story because he is reviving a dead Volva, a dead witch, to tell him the stories of, the future. I mean, of course, she tells the stories of the past, but he really wants to know about Ragnarok. And so you have the creation myth in here. You have a lot of basic information about the worlds and how the worlds are set up, about certain deities. A lot of gods are introduced in this story. You do get some information about Odin, like his eye, where his eye went. You get information about the Valkyries. And then, of course, you have Ragnarok and Odin's death. So this is almost like a glossary for things you can look deeper into. And certain things we just don't get more information about. And so basic information about Odin shared within this is where he came from. Basically, he was one of the first beings after Ymir.
This will be a long
of course,
video.
him and his brothers killed Ymir to create Midgard. They then created humankind. Odin gave breath to a piece of driftwood that created humans, the first humans. And then it kind of goes into the setup of Asgard, the setup of the universe and how it works. It covers the first war, the first Aesir-Vanir War, which sadly we don't have that much information of. After that, the Prose Edda covers it a little bit more, but we don't have a lot of information. But we do see the Aesir-Vanir conflict here. You learn of Odin's eye, what happened to it, that he gave it to Mimir to gain wisdom. You do get mentionings of Odin's family life. You get mentionings of Frigg being his wife. We do know of other lovers that are mentioned later on. Of course, Thor came from Jord, of the earth. And so Odin obviously takes on multiple lovers throughout the mythos, and which also creates many children, mostly sons, as we can see. Thor, of course, being one. Balder is mentioned, of course, and even Balder's death. And then we also have Hod is mentioned as well, and then of course Vidar is mentioned as the Avengers of Odin. So you do get this basic image of
with a wire brush as well.
But I think the
Just,
actual narrative of Voluspa is one of the key things to take from this is the
see
fact that
how
Odin
it
is
goes.
constantly seeking a way to stop
And that
Ragnarok.
button.
He's constantly seeking wisdom, such as Mimir's, giving his
I
eye
kinda
as
like
well.
doing it.
Writing down to raise the dead,
Like
which
this
has
way,
magic,
and
the ability to
very
raise the dead, to
therapeutic.
speak with them about these prophecies. So there's the whole narrative is Odin, and again, you can make a whole video about the Voluspa.
Exhausting on the arm.
It's an amazing story. It's probably, again, one of the most
Because of
popular
good
and known
training.
stories within Norse
Regime,
mythology.
because
The next major story is the next
little
story in the Poetic Edda, at
circles.
least in the Jackson Crawford edition, and that is the Havamal. Once again, we can make a whole video on the Havamal. In fact, I've made a whole video on the Havamal, about 15 stanzas.
You can already
So
sort of
again,
see
finding
that
a way to bring this all together is
coming
difficult.
better.
But really, if you're a Norse pagan, someone interested in Norse
Just with
paganism,
the
the
COR
Havamal
rust
is one of the most
removal.
important things for you to read.
Native light.
Because, unlike mythology, unlike Voluspa, where it's just giving you, like, a cow, really the Voluspa doesn't give this as a prose setup, as a cow licking the rhyme to, birth the first god, who then, like, mates with a giant to create Odin. Like, this is all stuff that is nice to know, and it gives you that blueprint in the back of your mind for what Norse mythology is and what this faith is. But when it comes to the actual faith, the Havamal is one of the most important, because it's Odin. It's called the words of the Highland, the words of One-Eyed. He is speaking to you, the reader, and giving you knowledge, wisdom, and advice. That is so cool. Honestly, I don't think this faith would be half of what it is today. I don't think any of us would have much of a practice without the Havamal. It is so important, and it's so important for you to read it. I think it's one of the biggest things I can recommend for you to read. There is just endless amounts of advice. Essentially you break into 4 sections. There's the guest narrative, where, again, it's a narrative-based story about Odin giving advice, about all things like hospitality, about gluttony, about alcoholism, about friendships and how to maintain them. It's about bravery. There's so many individual lines, and I really do believe every time you read the Havamal, specifically the first part, you're going to get something else out of it. And then there is a problem section a little bit, and this is something we're going to discuss within Harbert's Field as well, is Odin's love advice is not the best, and it's definitely not aged well. So there's obviously a lot of the advice is for men on women, but overall it seems like Odin's had a very hard love life, and he wants to give you advice, basically don't trust anybody, women lie all the time, men also lie all the time, and you should just never give your heart to anybody. But then it also says don't blame someone who's fallen in love, because we all do it. So it's interesting to see this. Again, is this Odin himself, or was this storytellers back in the Bronze Age of Norway telling them, like, well, son, that woman broke my heart, and then giving it through this narrative of Odin. Again, this is real life advice. This is obviously something people have told their children, their grandchildren, throughout history, but it's definitely from hundreds of years ago. It hasn't necessarily aged the best. The third section is kind of repetitive of the first. Odin is giving advice to a man named Loftfafnir, and the advice is very similar to the first section of the Havamal. It kind of just builds on it. Again, there's some great lines in here about friendship, about love, about how to, win victories over people. Again, it's just a really good section. And then we get to a really interesting section of the Havamal, which is, again, one of the reasons why I think it's so important, is because there's an entire section, a huge section on magic, and the magic that Odin learned hanging from the World Tree. And of course, Odin hanging from the World Tree for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spears, and offering of himself to himself, is one of the most important characteristics of him, and this comes from the Havamal. And what he gained from that is the magic of the runes, and of course magic as well. This is one of the most important motifs, is Odin hanging from the World Tree, and it's in the Havamal. I actually wanted to run through the list of spells that he mentions within this, because it is kind of interesting. It almost sounds like a D&D game if you play D&D, if you play fantasy games. Like, some of these spells are from that, so you can tell that maybe modern magic and video games and Harry Potter were inspired by the list of spells given within the Havamal. So the first section is how to use the runes, how to use them properly, how to create the runes. Important for people that want to get more
will be the best bit
that
for
is
you
standards
to
144.
see how well this works.
And then it does mention spiritual moderation and how not to burn yourself out. Basically saying that praying too much, giving too much is actually a bad thing. So that is an important note. And then it rolls into
into doing that now.
And so there's a spell
With
to get
the-
you out of trouble, a spell to heal, a spell
There
to
you
thwart your enemies, a spell of escape, a spell to specifically change the direction of a spear or weapon, a reflection spell against other magic, a spell of protection against flames, a spell to classify hatred and arguments, a spell to calm the seas, a spell to confuse magic users, a spell of battle
No, I
protection,
did.
a spell to revive the dead. You see him use this. A spell to protect a newborn from a violent death, a spell to gain knowledge, a spell to gain power, a love spell, a different love spell, and an unknown spell that is based around women that women shouldn't know about. Whew, Odin. Okay. Like I said, you can see these influences in our modern fantasies and our modern, magic fantasies. Now, of course, do I think that there are actual spells that are equivalent to this? No, I don't think that's how magic works, at least to us humans, maybe to a god. But, again, it's really cool. And I think the most important aspect for a practitioner today is the rune section, and then how not to spiritually burn yourself out, how not to give too much. So that is the Have-em-all. Again, I could cover this in an entire video. Already have, and it was a small section. Other people have. The Have-em-all is crazy. Have-em-all is huge, and it is so important. But I just wanted to give you an outline of, you need to read this thing first off if you hadn't, but how much of an important artifact this is to our faith today. It is a real advice, if not just from Odin, but from the people that lived over 1,000 years ago, maybe even 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. This advice is an ancestral thing that has been passed down through oral stories that eventually got written down, and that is so important. As we get into this third poem of the Poetic Edda, this is where, of course, I have to apologize. I'm not an Old Norse expert, and when I pronounce things, forgive me. So then we have Vafthrûdnismál, which is a story, and to me it seems like a much younger story, because the thing I love about this is it's a very energetic Odin at the very beginning. He wants to go prove his wisdom. He wants to go prove that he's the wisest being in all of the realms. Odin is talking to Frigg, and he's saying, I need to go prove that I am the wisest of all the beings in all the 9 realms. And I need to go to this man named Riddle Weaver, who lives in Jotunheim, who says he is also the wisest, and I need to have a contest of wills against him. And you see that energy in those first few lines where there's some pep in his step that you don't necessarily see about Odin. Even within the Have-em-all, he seems a little bit more weary. And of course, with the Völuspá, he seems to have more weight on his shoulders. Again, I love that energy in the first few sections of Vafthrûdnismál. But again, this is a very mythological, heavy section. We don't get a lot about Odin specifically, besides the fact that he goes to Jotunheim, talks to Riddle Weaver, and he does say that his name, again, we're going to have a whole video on Odin's names, and most of the stories he does actually go under a disguised name, and this one's no different. He goes under the name of Good Advisor. And so the Riddle Weaver actually doesn't know it's Odin, which is placed into the story as well. Again, this is a very mythology-heavy section, so when they actually get into their wisdom battle, where they go at each other and basically say, I know more than you. And so they go back and forth giving wisdom about the 9 realms and all that happened, showing how much they know. And I don't have enough time in one video, at least one section of a video to talk about all the wisdom that they give in this. But again, the main narrative is Odin is in a wisdom battle, and seems more youthful with Riddle Weaver. And of course we see him in disguise as Good Advisor. And at the very end, he wins this competition by saying in his last riddle to Riddle Weaver is, what does Odin say in Baldur's ear on his funeral pyre? And then Riddle Weaver says, the only person that knows that is you, Odin. And basically turns it into, I know you're Odin. But he also wins because it's something he doesn't know. So it's kind of cheap that he wins like, hey, what did I say to my dead son?
Really exhausted.
So it's kind of a cheeky way to win. But Odin does win, and Riddle Weaver calls him the wisest being in all the realms. And then we have another story about Norse mythos being shared among 2 people, where Odin is the main character. Hopefully you're seeing a theme. Odin is responsible for a lot of the lore-building sections of the Poetic Edda, where he is the central character, either saying the myths or someone else is saying it to him. So Grimnismál is no different. Again, the setup for this I've mentioned before in a video. I think it was my the Throne of Odin video. But Odin and Frigg are sitting on Hlodskjalf, which is the throne of Odin that allows him to see over the realms. And they essentially make a bet over who's going to be the better king between 2 people. And Odin, of course, wants to prove that he's right, and so he goes down to the king that he chose, and ends up getting captured by that king and treated horribly, and is set between 2 fires for several nights, getting no food and water. And then when, again, this is interesting because we know Odin knows spells, so it was probably him just trying to prove a point, seeing who would come up and give him food or water to prove that he was right in this argument when he knows these spells that could have easily gotten him out of these binds. But eventually we do see a small boy come up to him, basically giving him a drink and asking how he...
Fucking nerds.
5
Hey,
million
hey, look at that.
mobiles are
We're already
still
on
in
our
homes.
yeah.
That's one for every 5 people in Australia. Join the
No, where the
nationwide
fuck
challenge
that
to
other one went?
recycle unused mobiles and go for zero with Mobile Muster. Trusted for 25 years.
Ah. Got picked up in the
Try Airwick's scented oil
Alright.
plug-ins to revitalise your home with fragrance
Extra.
with natural essential oil.
Extra.
Enjoy up to 100 days of freshness.
Yeah, this
A
one's
breath
half done.
of fresh Airwick.
He is who he is. And we do see Odin again in a disguise where he says his name is Shadow-Faced or the Cloaked One.
I'll change the hands
And
for a
he
bit.
again goes into this long lore tangent. Again, very great at building the lore of the worlds that we know. Again, I can cover this in a whole video. I do actually have a reading of Grimnismal, and I have a reading of Wallace that I've done if you want to go into those as well.
Bar
where I just
bidding's
read to
probably
you,
not the word,
The Wallace and Grimnismal. Grimnismal, I get very animated in it as well. The most important thing for Odin within Grimnismal is we get a more detailed look of Valhalla and some more details about who Odin is, such as his wolves, Gary and Freki, who we know very little about, but we know he has these wolves because of Grimnismal. We also know the name of his hall. It's not actually Valhalla. The name of Odin's hall is called Glasskioth. Where Glasskioth actually is, and then Valhalla is its own separate thing. An interesting bit of information comes from stanza 7, is in a hall called Sakvabek. Odin and Saga, the goddess, drink mead every day. I'm not given much more information besides that, but it is interesting that Odin is hanging around another goddess named Saga every day. I wonder what's happening there. So this is also where we're given a more in-depth look and a description of Valhalla, such as the 640 doors, the Einherjar, what they eat, where they get their meat from, how they're fed, all these things. Then we're also told about Hugin and Mugen and how Odin only drinks alcohol, which is important for when we get to the honoring Odin today. This is why alcohol is such an important offering to give to Odin, because from what we know, he doesn't actually eat meat. Now, I have given him meat before, I have given him food. It doesn't seem to go poorly, but I think alcohol is such an important thing for Odin specifically. The last section of this is the great reveal, and Odin reveals who he is to the king that imprisoned him and who he put his bet on. I think his name is Geralt or Geralt. His name is Geralt. And so, again, this is where I get very animated in my reading of Grimnismal, is Odin turns the tables and lists all of his names. He's like, my name is, Warbringer, Raven Lord, One-Eyed, Allfather, all these things. He lists 50 different names for Odin, and then he says his name is Odin as the big reveal to Geralt that he messed up because he imprisoned the god. And then it appears that Odin enchanted Geralt's sword to stab himself, because basically Geralt trips, his sword falls, and then Geralt dies on his own sword. And this is interesting because it doesn't say that Odin admits it, but the child that gave him a drink and listened to his tale was the son of the king that Frigg had bet on. And so Frigg was right. And that's another thing I love about the story, is that Odin is this big, powerful, scary deity who, kills this king who he put a bet on, but at the end of the day, his wife is right. And now we've come to Harvard's Field, my favorite story in the Poetic Edda, perhaps in Norse mythology in general, just because it is Odin giving his son shit. And it's just him yelling at Thor, taunting him and mocking him. So there is quite a bit that Odin mentions about himself here, but it's hard to say if he's actually telling the truth or not. Because there are some sections where it just seems like he's trying to antagonize Thor. He's saying that Thor's mother has died, which would be is dead, and so that seems definitely like a lie. It's talking about how someone's wanting to sleep with Thor's wife, and that was most likely a lie as well. Well, maybe it was mentioning Loki. But in stanza 50, which is towards the end, Odin even says, I think I'm telling the truth. Thor is basically saying that he's a liar, and he's like, I think I'm telling the truth. And so it definitely seems like he's pulling Thor's leg, and maybe that's just me trying to rationalize this story. But real quick, for people that don't know, again, read the Poetic Edda, but essentially Thor is coming home from a long trip. He gets to a fjord, there's a ferryman on the other side, and he says, hey, can you send me over the boat? And the ferryman basically starts mocking him, and he's like, I was only supposed to let over good people. And it's Odin in disguise, and eventually Thor does realize it's Odin in disguise. You kind of see that in the dialogue. But again, I think this is a really great father-son thing. You know, I've had these kind of things with my dad where we kind of, you know, get on each other. I mean, every father and son butt heads eventually in some way. And so I think this is cool. Again, we're seeing this in a story. So I really don't know what to take here. There's some mentions of how Odin spent 5 years waging war on an island. And it's like, does this actually happen? I don't know.
Another
Is this
going
culture of
over.
the faith today? I don't really think so.
The rest of
There's
it looks
mentionings
pretty fucking good, although I could probably polish that
Odin
out.
turning princes against one another, and they never made peace. This is
I don't want
something
to
we see as an aspect of Odin.
I want to try and get it out. I might even have to go.
He does wage wars between two factions, often on
sandpaper.
both sides, either to get
Low grip,
their
but-
warriors to Valhalla, or to basically see who's the better
First things
king.
first at the moment.
We see a reference in Lokasenna how Odin always chooses the wrong side in conflict. So maybe this is right. Again, I really don't know what to take seriously. Maybe this is just me trying to rationalize the fact that we have to talk about an uncomfortable subject matter, and it's something that we all kind of beat around the bush, and it's the fact that in Harbert's the Old, Odin openly mentions that he forced himself on multiple women and uses this as a way to gloat
also get
towards
a new-
Thor. And even at one point, Thor's like, if I was there, I would have helped you hold down that woman.
Ooh, bit of steel in a minute.
Again, this is something with time that hasn't
First
held
things
up
first,
well. Maybe
I'll
doesn't
remember
work
that
through
smack.
translation, or maybe at the end of the day, we just have to accept the fact that gods are gods and they do what they want. I don't know. This is a hard subject to talk about, but it's the reality of Harbert's the Old. Is we have a section talking about how Odin took advantage of women and how
Continue
Thor would
watching
have helped
this.
him.
Which is
Again, I think this is something with age, with
actually
time.
pretty
Obviously,
good.
This is not something that exists now. This is again where I have to
Also,
bring in. I don't put much
Jacob
weight behind the god's sexualities. I don't really
Thompson.
see them as having sex with people
On
or in
YouTube.
this case, forcing
Good channel
themselves
for
on people. I don't
information.
really see that. I see this as something that came from the past, as something that came from the people who told these stories. Humans have put sexuality on the gods, not the gods actually having sexuality. And
I
so
only use like
I
a
don't put
steel
much
line.
weight behind the fact that there's a line saying that Odin forced himself
Oh,
on
that
women. I
way,
don't think this
yeah.
actually happened. I think this is from the fact this was written over 1,000 years ago. It was told over 1,000 years ago, and this is just a part
And-
of society back then that we, that luckily today we are starting to take greater stands against, things like this. But it is part of history, and we just have to accept that and make our peace with it. Anyways, back to the happy side of Harvest Moon. I do think that my favorite
That
part
could
at
really
the end
get better.
is where basically
Because the
King
rest
gets
of
the
the
last laugh, because he's
is-
obviously not going to give the fairy to
fuck,
Thor,
right.
and he basically says,
fucking
"Look,
just-
you're going to have to walk all the way
fucking
around
get
the
that
floor,
better.
come all the way back," and kind of gets that nice laugh.
Then
and
I'll,
Thor, obviously threatens to
that
kill him,
one up
and Odin's
there
just
too.
like, "I hope you have a terrible journey."
Probably
And that is so
go
sarcastic, and I
get
love
some
it.
oil.
So,
I'll probably stop
despite
this.
the negative
Go
side
and
of
get some
Harvest Moon
oil.
and uncomfortable conversation there, I really like this aspect of Odin, the sarcastic father.
Might even have a bit.
See a story like this.
Oh no, it's 4 now.
So those stories are actually
Oh,
the
get
main
this
Odin
done.
stories that we have within the
Please.
Poetic Edda. There's now mentionings of
Cleared
them
off.
throughout several stories. And
No,
then we do have
polish it.
Baldur's Drama, which is Odin going down to
Oil.
hell to find out
And wrap
about
it up.
Baldur's death. Again, this is Odin as the main character, but we don't actually get that much more information about Odin. It's really about
Actually,
description of Helheim, what
I
lore we
did it.
have.
I had a
It's talking
pause.
about Odin, obviously being worried about Baldur's death.
And
We
go get
also
the
see
oil.
Odin using the spell to raise the dead
Next
once again
steps.
on a witch. King Freya and Loki.
Now I'm back.
Rosetta actually did give some information that we wouldn't
Wax.
have otherwise, and that's true for Odin as well.
Wax on.
But this is where it really
Had a
helps
waxing
to
rag.
read Rosetta. Just because Snorri does
Oil.
so
and
much
glad
more
wrap
to
to do
discredit Odin as a deity,
the finishing.
even though that he obviously holds him in a high place. He calls him the highest of all
Let's try
gods,
and get
but he
this
really wants to Christianize
last.
Odin and make it very clear that people reading the Prose Edda should not be heathen and they should be Christian.
Bit of the helmet done.
And again, this is very prevalent in the Odin section. Right away, in the very beginning, we have an entire summary of who Odin actually was. And he was basically a son of a noble from Troy in Turkey, and that he had a vision that he needed to go to the north because his name would be known there. And then him and all of his followers left to go to Germany, and they settled in Saxony for modern-day Saxony for some time. And it was for several years because he ends up having several sons, and then 3 of his sons become the kings of Germany at that time. And then Odin leaves again and goes up to Denmark and spends some time in Denmark, has a son, leaves a son in charge of Denmark, and then Odin travels up to Sweden, where of course he stays for some time. He has another son, the son becomes the king of Sweden, and then he ends his journey in Norway. And it sets up the Council of Asgard, which is 12 deities, the 12 Aesir gods, in the same way that they set up the council in Troy. I mean, this would suck if this was true, because it'd be like, oh, so we're living a lie. But most scholars and most people discredit Snorri because he clearly was trying to Christianize the faith.
Yeah.
And again, as I have explored in a video, which was the history of the Prose and Poetic Edda, Snorri did not have the best of intentions in writing this. I mean, the Prose Edda is a textbook for people that want to write skaldic verse, and Snorri was constantly looking for a way to establish divine right for the king of Norway at the time,
It's
who he had a very close relationship with. And so, as a skald himself, and as the king of Norway, he was of course a Christian king in the 1300s, he needed to establish a divine right to rule in the Nordic style, because of course Christian kings said that God himself gave them the right to rule. And I can surmise that the Nordic kings also wanted this, but they wanted it from their own gods. So Snorri made it his mission to make a connection between dynasties and Odin, and saying that, oh, all the kings in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Germany are descendants of Odin, and therefore they have the divine right to rule. So this appeared to be Snorri's mission. So again, a lot of this information feels very tainted when it comes to Odin because of this perspective. But I am trying my best to find information that may be still relevant to you. But again, this is also interesting because we know that Snorri read the Poetic Edda, or the Codex Regius, as it was known, before it was lost. So we know a lot of this information came from that. So it's hard to say where the rest of that information came from. The Positive Mind says that we hope it came from Icelandic storytelling, but also could be complete fabrications by Snorri. And it appears that a lot of the information that Snorri wrote about Odin seems to be from the Poetic Edda, and it just gives us some more, details, really. It gives us more facade, gives us more color, maybe a different perspective. And you can maybe see all the notes I took here. I highlighted the sections that actually seem to be important, so there's a lot of information here about Odin, and Odin seems to partake in many stories, but we're not given a lot of information about Odin. So I'm just going to run through it the best I can. Of course, the Prose Edda is not very organized. It's organized into 3 sections, and then the stories are all kind of lumped in there. So I'm going to do my best here, but it's the Prose Edda. Have mercy on me. So, of course, we are given more information about Odin's parenting, that he came from the god Bor and the giantess Bestla. And, of course, Odin had his 3 brothers, Slay and Ymir. And we're given a little bit more detail on the creation, like on how specifically they made Midgard and formed Midgard from Ymmir's flesh. There is an interesting section which comes from page 13 of my Everyman's Edda, which is the edition I have, where it mentions that the earth was his daughter and his wife, which in technicality, I guess that's true. If York is Midgard, if York is the earth, the giants of the earth, technically he did help make that, and then technically he did create a son, Thor, with York. Again, sexuality in the gods, not really important to me. This is kind of why, because do I think Odin humped the ground and created Thor? No. But do I think the relationship between Thor, the wisdom god, the breath god, and the earth itself created thunderstorms and the thunder god? Yeah, that's probably more likely. But again, that's dealing with more of my personal viewpoints. I'm really trying to give you the information the best I can, but truly, I don't see an incestuous relationship between Odin and the earth. One thing that the Prose Edda I do think is really good is the fact that we get so many names for Odin, because Snorri is trying to create a textbook for skaldic verse, and so we're given a lot of different names for Odin throughout this, which of course we're going to explore in Wednesday's video. So names were given such as Allfather, Valfather, the Hanged God, Hapta God, which just means the god of prisoners, and then we're given like Bolveric later, and then another name in page 86 of mine in the Tale of Hrungnir is the Helmet-Capped Educator, which I actually really love that name. So the names of Odin and those that are actually pretty well done and pretty well preserved, it seems. We're also giving a more complete list of Odin's children. So of course we have Balder, Hod, Vidar, Ali and Vali, who I know nothing about, Hermund the Bold, and then of course Vidar as well. And of course we know Odin's wife is Frigg, which is listed by Snorri as well, even though he also says he's married to the earth. But we're also known of a lover named Rind, or Rind, or Rind. And then another lover is mentioned later, which is Gunnlod. One note I made that I found really interesting is I thought Odin was more involved in the Binding of Fenrir story. Maybe this is because I played Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Perhaps it was. But to me, I always thought Odin was more directly involved with the Binding of Fenrir. But he actually isn't directly named in the Binding of Fenrir story. It's really just Tyr. And he is labeled and put together with the Aesir gods. It says the Aesir gods. We can assume Odin is with them. And that is actually a theme through many of these stories that are quite known from the Prose Edda, is Odin isn't actually a direct player, he is just labeled with the other Aesir gods. We picture him in our minds in those stories. And no better example exists than the Origins of Sleipnir, which is from the Wall of Asgard story, the story of how a builder built the wall around Asgard, and of course Loki gets them into a bind, and Loki gets out of them, and creates Sleipnir, the horse of Odin. And again, Odin is only mentioned in the story as one of these. And so he's not really a direct participant in the story, so we're not getting more information about Odin. Again, this is just a nice story in Norse mythos you should read. And of course, it's got the interesting story of Loki and the horse. But this does actually create Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that Odin rides, that we see as a very important part of the artifacts that we have that preserve Odin, which we'll explore, of course, at the very end of this video. And then we have the story of Baldur's death and Ragnarok, where we're not given more information really than we were given in the Prose Edda. Baldur's death a little bit more so. We have a little bit more information. Important notes is it mentions that Odin summons 4 berserkers to haul the funeral boat, and they can't. They eventually have to get a giant to do it. So it's interesting to see the mentioning of Odin's berserkers, maybe just the Einherjar that do this as well. And then we do also have the part where Odin sends his other son Hermund, who's not mentioned in the Poetic Edda from what I can tell. He sends Hermund the Bold with Draupnir down to Helheim to try to win back Baldur from Hell. And of course, this is what starts the story of them having to go to every being and ask them to cry and whatnot. This isn't necessarily Odin himself, he's just part of the framework of that story. Because obviously his son died. And then you have Ragnarok, where we're really not given any more detail. We're given a little bit more of a descriptive detail of what Odin looks like. Let's see, I'm actually going to go ahead and read that to you, because again, it's just a little bit more detail just to show kind of what we're working with. And it seems to be more of a creative addition that Snorri added, rather than maybe a fact. So again, it gives us a little bit more detail. Then Odin will ride to Mimir's well and consult Mimir on his own and on his people's behalf. Then the ash so will shake, and nothing will then be unafraid in heaven or on earth. The Aesir will put on their war gear, and so will all the Einherjar, and advance to the field. Odin will ride in front with a golden helmet and a fine coat of mail, and a spear called Hrungnir. And that's basically it. So again, we're getting a little bit more detail, and this is a theme throughout a lot of the Prose Edda. So that's actually it for Gylfaginning, which is the main core group of stories. Again, Odin is actually not mentioned a lot. He's mentioned quite a bit in Skaldskaparmál, which is the kennings and the ways to use the gods and the stories within Skaldic verse. There are actually several stories hidden within Skaldskaparmál, so if you haven't actually dove into that, there's a lot of really good stories hidden in here as well. This is where maybe I can take a little bit more truth out of Odin, out of Snorri's interpretation of him. Because there's the story of Thiazi, and this seems to be another early story of Odin, Loki, and Honir, which may also be Odin, Vili, and Ve from some people's theories, and I might believe that as well, and how Loki stirs up the giant Thiazi, who they have to kill because Thiazi steals Idun, they have to kill him, and then Skabi comes to Asgard to get revenge for her father Thiazi's death, and then eventually gets to marry Njord, who has the best feet. And Odin makes a deal with Skabi as well to put the eyes of Thiazi in the sky as stars. And this is one of the few mentionings we have of constellations and stars within the entire Norse mythos as well. So again, an interesting side note for Odin putting the eyes in the sky of Thiazi. And then on pages 63 and 64, given the most unique detail about Odin, and that is the Mead of Poetry story, which you can read in Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology book, The Modern Lens. And it's a really long story. Again, I could probably spend a whole episode dissecting it, but I want to give you the most important information. Essentially, the summary is that Odin wants to go get the Mead of Poetry that a giant had made. His name was Sutton. And so he disguises himself and wanders, I believe it's I would surmise. And then he comes up to 9 slaves, and he pulls out a whetstone, which will sharpen any blade. He sharpens all the slaves' blades, and then he basically gets them all to argue with one another, and he throws the whetstone into the air, and they all kill each other trying to get it. So these 9 slaves die, and he goes to the farmer that owned those 9 slaves, and the farmer, his name is Baugi, or Balgi. And he's freaking out
Giant
because now
mound.
his 9 slaves are dead and he's not going to be able to get the
Well-
summer work done. And so Odin, disguised
I'm
as
not rubbing that
Baldur,
off.
says, "Oh, I'll work for you and I'll do the same
Yes.
work as those 9
Still
slaves."
very oily.
So Odin works for this giant for a whole summer to earn his trust. And he does this because Baugi the giant is the son of Suttung, the giant who owns the Mead of Poetry. So he hopes that Baugi can get him into the Mead of Poetry. And he can't actually get him in there, but he does agree to help him dig into the mountain to get into the vault where the Mead of Poetry is held. So Odin and Baugi get a drill bit and start drilling into the mountain to try to get in there. And something that is interesting for Balverk as a character is that every time they would drill to see if they actually hit the other side, he would blow into the hole and see if anything came back to see if they actually cut to the other side. And so after the second attempt, Baugi actually turns on Odin and tries to kill him. And then Odin turns into a snake and slithers into the hole. So we see a lot of shape changing in this. So we obviously have Odin in his disguise. This is actually one of the few stories we see Odin actually shape change into a different animal. So he turns into a snake, gets into the hole.
We'll cover
And
that.
this is where he meets the giantess Gunlod, where he who is actually guarding the Mead of Poetry, and he spends 3 nights with her, obviously, doing things with her. And this is actually a theory of where Bragi comes from, because she was guarding the Mead of Poetry. And of course, that's a different story. But once she was sleeping, he went and drank from the 3 vats of the Mead Poetry and drank it all, and then turns into an eagle and flies away with all the meat in his stomach. And then the Suttung, the giant, also turns into an eagle and chases after Odin. Odin flies over Asgard, and they have containers there, and he spits all the Mead of Poetry into those containers,
Roll this up.
and then also, I believe, farts some, poops some on Thiazi as well, chasing after him. And this is the origin of where poetry comes from, and this is also why poetry is a kinning for the spit of Odin, or the meat of the gods, or the meat of Odin. So this is, of course, in Skarsgård explaining that kinning. But again, a very interesting story, and I do think there's some credibility to it, because I don't think there doesn't seem to be any Christian manipulation in the story. But it's a really fun story that, again, I don't know how much of Odin you're getting from this story as far as modern interpretation, but it's an interesting myth that is a lot of fun to share as well. And all that goodwill story creates with the Mead of Poetry story that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable about believing him is all thrown away immediately afterwards when he discredits Odin again. It's like he detected the fact that he's like, ooh, people might like the story too much, and so he has to discredit him once again and say that he was just a man that lived in Troy who was killed by a man named Pyrrhus, and that this man was also called the Wolf, so this was the death of Odin. But wait a second, Story, didn't you say that Odin traveled from Troy all the way up to Denmark, and now you're saying that he was killed in Troy by a man named Pyrrhus? Snorri, get your story straight. The next tale we have does involve Odin slightly, and this is the tale of Hrungnir, which I cover some in my Thor video and some in my Valhalla video as well, because this is this one story that we have that might represent Valknut and being Hrungnir's heart. At the very start of the story, Odin rides down the Jotunheim, again, very similar to how he did with Riddleweaver, the one-eyed wanderer himself. I hope to see the other 2 videos that come out this week, which are the many names of Odin, and then, of course, honoring Odin today in the modern world. Thank you so much, and until the hall, Skull.
Oil filled there.
Coles, there's hundreds of prices on dropped and locked into the 4th of July, like Tip Top Cafe Raisin Toast. Now just $5
No, I don't need much.
a pack. And Kellogg's Cornflakes cereal, now $4.25 each. That's value the Australian way at Coles. Seeing the world is nice, but looking at all of Virgin Australia and earning velocity points, that's wonderful. Where shall we go? So kids, nice. Goodbye.
Just giving them a bit extra.
This video is sponsored by Skillshare. More to come on that shortly.
The other day.
So, Crofty, after both of us being somewhat worse for wear in the last episode, we are back from the dead, so to speak, to try again.
Yes, we
That's
are
better.
indeed. Unfortunately not resurrected to eternal life by Osiris like we hoped.
No, it's back to the old-fashioned digging through the dirt to escape our coffins, because in our absence our loved ones stepped in and did the decent thing and had us buried. Which, of course, we're now going to hold a grudge against them for and drain their blood.
Yeah, or I would, but I'm having a bit of a problem with that.
No?
Well, you know how normally vampires aren't supposed to be able to cross the threshold without being invited in?
Yes.
When I get invited in, I'm like, oh, no, don't go to any bother, I wouldn't want to impose, no, don't do any of that. And so I've not actually fed since I got resurrected.
That's a bit of a problem. What you have to just do is just, like, make them feel obligated to offer you just half a pint of their blood, just to get you started, you know. Oh, go on.
I use my politeness against them.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you go, oh, I don't want to intrude, but it would be rude of me not to drain you for everything I possibly can. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mythological. My name is Charles. I'm joined today, I can't say by my cool sidekick Crofty, because he appears to have been promoted. And we're here once again to ramble on about all things folklore and mythology for far too long.
Well, we do kind of have eternity now, so...
Exactly, and what better way to spend eternity than talking about today's topic? So at the end of our last episode, Crofty, we outlined roughly what the next subject was going to be, and I think we have to say we probably went down the wrong foxhole, so to speak, in terms of what we were intending to do.
Yes, I was asked to give a hint, and on the spot my options were to mention the Lakia or to hum the Buffy theme. And my lungs were not up to the Buffy theme that day.
Exactly, so we ended up hinting that we were going to do what particular topic, Crofty?
Vampires, as you may have guessed from the opening to this episode.
Indeed, and we're kind of covering vampires with a little bit of a twist, because almost everyone out there is going to be familiar in some fashion with the more modern idea of a vampire as a refined count or gentleman, possibly also having something of a seductive element, in addition to being a undead bloodsucker. What we want to focus on in this particular podcast episode is the actual folklore associated with vampires, because what we discovered is that basically
Not the romanticised
modern image that we
bullshit.
have of the vampire has very, very little to do with actual folklore. So, for example, in the course of our hint for the last episode, we mentioned a certain Vlad Tepes, or better known as Vlad the Impaler, who was a prince of Wallachia in, I believe, the 15th century, who I
Not a vampire.
affectionately refer to as Vladislav the Poker. Let's see who gets that reference.
Just
And
a
what
fucking
we
macabre
really discovered is that when it comes to vampire folklore, Vlad the Impaler doesn't really come into things. There are various bloodthirsty legends that are associated with him in the centuries after his death, but from what I can tell, his modern association with the figure of the vampire really didn't come into things until the more modern literary creation of the vampire, which dates from the early 19th century onwards.
Get
So
this
in the
live
course of
build up.
this episode, we're going to be focusing on discovering a strain of vampirism
probably use
that
oil.
runs both much older and
The
much
wide by the
deeper
line shit when you got
than
that
modern Bram Stoker image.
on hand.
However, Crofty, that decision, I think, leaves us in a bit of a pickle, doesn't it? Because it turns out there are a vast number of different entities that people over time have claimed to be vampires of one form or another across the world.
Oh yeah, this is only my
Yes.
skinning kit and not
I
the
did
hunting
have
kit.
a similar experience here in
Noticed.
Wild Hunt, in which I found
Says
quite
at
a
least
lot of
fucking
references to creatures described as
8
vampires
knives missing.
from various countries, and when looking further into it, found that that connection was
Right.
tenuous at best and non-existent at worst.
Yeah, I think from the way you described it to me
Before fucking-
when we were messaging back and forth discussing
Ah,
how we were
I
going to
know where
structure this
they are.
episode, I had this vision in my head of
Very
like a
feasting kit.
Scooby-Doo episode where you've got the bad guy tied up
Oh,
in a
the
sort of like, ha, we're going to rip off the mask
carving
and figure out
ones.
who's really responsible. And
that's
you
nice.
rip off the mask and go, oh, it's you again.
I don't think I need to do any more sanding.
And who was that assistant of yours?
Yeah.
Christianity.
Yes.
Go back to
So that sounds like it's going to be an interesting experience.
number 1.
One thing that we've done to kind of narrow down the topic a little bit is what we've done is we've gone and selected a couple of different criteria
And
in
remembering,
order to find what we consider to be a vampire.
I've had a couple
So,
of
Poppy, I
drinks.
believe you can give us those criteria.
Yes, it's two quite simple criteria. One is that they must be undead, and the other is that they must feed on blood. We're allowing a bit of leeway in that certain creatures will feed on some sort
Maybe
of
I shall.
mysterious life force,
Do that
because often that does tend to get associated with blood in religion and various forms of mythology and
done
mysticism.
that often now that my hair is
In
too.
terms of being undead, I think in some cases we can allow that unnaturally extending life rather than dying and coming back. But that might be a case-by-case basis.
I must admit I've also gone into some entities that don't exactly fit the mould, but I think are quite useful in helping set up some later ideas of vampirism.
Well,
Otherwise, we've tried to be quite specific about what we're going to cover in this episode.
yeah, so the spoiler a lot of my section will be, and this is why this creature
Yeah,
that
this
is
is
called vampire
real.
really isn't a vampire.
Yeah.
Dressing.
So from how we've been describing it so far, you can
Hunting
probably
kit.
tell we've split up where in the world we're going to be looking for these particular creatures. So the original
stabbers
plan was
or
going to be that I would cover the European traditions
Field
of
stabber.
vampirism and possibly older traditions
burner.
that may come by way of the ancient Near East.
Also another bone.
However, in practice, I largely ended up focusing almost entirely on Eastern European traditions associated with vampires. So that's really where I'm going to be coming from on this. Often, however, you're going to be focusing on basically vampiric entities or claimed vampiric entities from around the rest of the world.
Yes, it will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, because a lot of these entities there's a very limited amount of reliable information to go on. I've tried to be as thorough as possible.
I've had almost the exact opposite problem where
Oh.
I had so much material
That's
where
good.
I probably could have written a script that went on for, 10 hours or something
That
like
cut
that.
all.
It
That one's
really, for me, was a case of pick and choose what I end up including. So,
Cut
with
through
that
the
in
tail.
mind, it's probably a good moment for us to mention
That's
our
good.
sources for this episode, because looking at how patchy in
cut
some
through the
ways
tail.
my account inevitably has had to be of a reasonable
That cut
time for a
through the tail.
podcast, people may want to go off and explore some
And
of the
that
threads I
cut through
touched
the
upon
tail, but-
more in their own time.
Just so you can
So, my sources for today,
actually
the
see
main
yourself.
source was The
There's that
Vampire,
line.
A New History by Nick Broom, which is a pretty authoritative account of vampires from their folkloric and ancient roots all the way through to modern concepts of the vampire. In addition to this, I also looked at Vampires, Burial and Death, Folklore and Reality by Paul Barber, which was a really good account for having some of the first-hand reports of vampire scares that I will discuss shortly. Alongside this, I also used some sections from the book Vampire Forensics, uncovering the origins of an enduring legend by Mark Collins
I got it.
Jenkins.
But
And I
every
used
single one
some
of them.
very small
you can see.
sections from Mummies,
Cut
Cannibals and
sections of a
Vampires
towel,
by Richard Sugg.
which is
And then the very last thing to mention is I did use a copy of an article called Vampirism
there
and
it is.
Medicine by N. Kluger, B.
Oh.
Tribier and B.
that is for my
Haluiak. The slight problem with this article is it was entirely in French, so I basically went through the Google Translate version
Field
because it
status.
turns out you can now
We
drop
have two.
documents into
Either
Google Translate and it
that
will
one.
translate PDFs for you,
And that one, or
which
that one.
is kind of cool. So basically, if anyone wants a copy
And
of
that
that,
one,
hit me
that
up
one
on
often goes
Twitter
in the
and I'll
other
send over the brute force translated
section
version
only.
that I have.
On my belt.
I realise I should have cleared this with you beforehand, Charles, but for my section,
Knife in,
I am going to have to reference as I
burn
go,
up,
just because
burn up.
as I covered the entire world and such a massive variety of creatures, the references are just scattered all over the place. There's things where I will be saying there's no reliable source. I just keep finding mention of this without backup, things like that. So I will keep the references as I go. Will say where I've had to just do something that I could not find a good source for, is take that
Stone in.
result. Hopefully it'll be coherent.
With the steel.
Yeah, as we've had in the past with this podcast, sometimes with folklore, the references can be somewhat unreliable, so that's understandable.
Me two boners.
And before we go on, Crofty, I would like to take a moment just to thank this episode's sponsor.
And you feel
This episode is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes to explore. Whether you're looking to get the
Doctor's
most out
back.
of a hobby, or you would like to turn your
That's
interest
good
into a
for buddy.
profession, Skillshare can provide you with
What's his
classes at every skill level.
H.H.
Something I
Holmes,
hear
as
online
everybody
a lot is
knows him
people
as.
saying that they could never
The
turn
dude who
their
had
hobbies
the
into a successful
Murder
YouTube
Hotel,
channel.
or
So, at the risk of
I know
creating
him
more
better.
competition for Crofty and myself, today I'm going to highlight a Skillshare course that will show you how you can do just that.
Boost.
The tech YouTuber Marquez Brownlee, also known as MKBHD,
Holmes was
is a
a
tech
name he
YouTuber with over
acquired.
15 million subscribers, and he's sharing his secrets with the course, YouTube Success,
It's not
Script,
his actual
Shoot,
name.
and Edit with MKBHD. In this course, he walks you through coming up with an initial idea, how to
Envy.
research, write, shoot and edit your videos. He
What
gives you some tips on how to promote and grow your channel.
And
Marquez is entirely
If you really
self-taught,
wanna know.
going from creating videos in his parents' basement
that's basically
to leading
the
a
top
full
of the
team of
tyre that he would
professionals,
have had.
and you can get the
The only
benefit of his
fussy thing is,
experience to
I've
help
got
you
a
build your
different
own channel.
beard.
Now, outside of
Thanks, Mom. That's just a standard too, by the smell of that. But 3:17 and I've finished my work at the bakery for the night. And I've gotten home, had a shower. Shit. Shave. Yeah, right. Don't do that part. And sitting down, have a turkey first thing in the morning for my 39th. To the gods or anyone else who wants to have a drink with me for my 39th birthday.